The man on the bench could end lives with a phone call, yet he sat motionless, watching the reedy river carry golden light downstream as if searching for something the water had stolen long ago. Jalen Routh's hands rested on his knees, unmarked by scars, but heavy with decisions that turned men into ghosts without a single bullet fired. Across the path, hidden behind an oak tree's gnarled trunk, a boy traced the edge of his blue watch with trembling fingers. Emmerich Dareth had been following this man for 3 days, memorizing his patterns like studying enemy territory in a game he was too young to play. The watch ticked against his racing pulse, each second bringing him closer to a decision that defied every warning his mother had whispered about dangerous men. The blue plastic caught fragments of dying sunlight, transforming a cheap Christmas gift into something that felt precious as gold. His palms were slick with sweat that had nothing to do with the Carolina heat. The park smelled of cut grass and river mud, mixing with the faint exhaust from Main Street 2 blocks away. Families packed up picnic blankets as shadows stretched long and purple across the walking trails. Children's laughter echoed from the playground equipment, a sound that seemed to belong to a different world than the one Emmerich inhabited lately. His sneakers were coming apart at the seams, held together by his mother's careful stitching and prayers that stretched thin as the thread. The shirt he wore had been washed so many times, the cartoon character on the front had faded into a blue ghost. Jalen shifted slightly, his eyes tracking a heron that landed on the opposite bank with prehistoric grace. He came here when the weight of his empire pressed too hard, when solving other people's problems left no room for questions he couldn't answer. The river didn't judge, didn't ask for favors, didn't expect him to be anything, except still. Power had a cost that banks couldn't calculate, paid in sleepless nights and mirrors that reflected someone he barely recognized. This bench offered the only peace his world allowed, 30 minutes of pretending he was just another man watching water flow. Emmerich's mother thought he was at the library, lost in picture books about space explorers and talking animals. Instead, he'd been researching this man through whispered conversations overheard at the corner store, through the way adults lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned. The boy had learned that fear and respect wore the same face in Greenville, and that Jalen Routh's name carried both in equal measure. 3 afternoons of watching had taught him the man's routine. The same bench, the same stillness, the same moment when the world seemed to pause. Today would be the day he broke that stillness with a request that terrified him more than any nightmare. His fingers worked the watch clasp, feeling the cheap metal warm from his skin. The gift had arrived on Christmas morning, wrapped in paper his mother had saved from the previous year, smoothed flat and reused because new things were luxuries their budget couldn't afford. He remembered her smile as he'd opened it, remembered how she'd called it his timekeeper, and said he was growing into a young man who needed to understand responsibility. What she didn't say, but what he heard in her tired eyes, was that time was running out for them both. The Cobrador had visited again last night, standing in their doorway with papers that rustled like dead leaves, and a voice smooth as oil spreading across water. Emmerich had pressed his ear against his bedroom wall, listening to threats wrapped in legal language his 9 years couldn't fully decode. But he understood enough, understood that men in suits could steal homes just as effectively as men with guns. His mother's crying had been silent, the kind that shook shoulders without making sound. She thought he was asleep, thought the thin walls protected him from adult burdens. But Emmerich had stopped being a child the first time he'd counted coins with her at the kitchen table, watched her choose between electricity and groceries, seen her add water to soup to make it stretch another meal. Childhood was a luxury, like new wrapping paper, and he'd lost his somewhere between unpaid bills and midnight tears. Jalen's phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it, a rare act of defiance against the constant demands of his position. The people who worked for him knew better than to call during these river sessions unless buildings were burning or blood was being spilled. Evening light turned the water into liquid amber, and for a moment, he could almost forget the empire that waited for his return. The boy stepped out from behind the tree, his decision made before courage could abandon him. His legs felt disconnected from his body as they carried him forward across the grass that separated innocence from necessity. The watch dangled from his hand now, its blue band catching light like a small flag of surrender. Jalen noticed the movement in his peripheral vision, a small figure approaching with the cautious determination of someone walking toward a cliff edge. He didn't turn his head immediately, didn't acknowledge the presence that disrupted his carefully maintained solitude. Years of surviving through awareness had taught him to catalog threats before engaging them directly, but this wasn't a threat. The footsteps were too light, too hesitant, carrying the rhythm of youth rather than malice. When he finally looked, he found a boy standing precisely 6 feet away, close enough to speak but far enough to run if necessary. The child's stance spoke of careful calculation, despite the fear that widened his dark eyes and trembled through his thin frame. Intelligence lived in that face, mixed with desperation that made Jalen's chest tighten with recognition he didn't want to feel. The boy held something in his outstretched hand, a plastic watch that caught the fading light and transformed it into something almost magical. His fingers gripped it tightly, as if afraid it might escape before he could complete whatever mission had brought him here. The blue band was scuffed from wear, the face scratched but still ticking with reliable persistence. Jalen studied him with the same attention he gave to business negotiations and territorial disputes. The clothes told stories of a mother who cared but couldn't afford to care enough. Clean but faded, mended but wearing through. The boy's hair needed cutting, his face needed more meals, but his eyes held something that poverty couldn't diminish. "Sir." The word came out stronger than the trembling hand suggested, carrying weight that didn't belong in a child's vocabulary. Emmerich forced his voice steady through sheer willpower, knowing that this moment would define everything that came after. The watch felt heavier now, transformed from possession into offering, from gift into currency for something he couldn't name but desperately needed. His mother's face flashed through his mind, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the way she smiled through worry, the sound of her silent crying. Jalen remained motionless, his expression revealing nothing but his attention absolute. He'd built an empire on reading people, on seeing through deception to the truth beneath. This child wasn't trying to deceive, he was trying to survive, and the distinction mattered more than the boy could possibly understand. "This is my Christmas watch." Emmerich's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion he was trying to contain. He held it higher, extending his arm until his shoulder ached from the strain. "It's the best thing I got. It keeps perfect time, never stops, never slows down." The words tumbled out faster now, as if speed could prevent second-guessing. His throat felt tight, his eyes burned with tears he refused to shed in front of this man who everyone said never showed weakness. The river continued its endless journey behind them, indifferent to human drama unfolding on its banks. A breeze carried the smell of evening, cooling concrete, distant cooking, the green scent of growing things preparing for darkness. Other park visitors had cleared out, leaving them isolated in a bubble of confrontation that felt both infinite and impossibly fragile. Jalen's eyes moved from the watch to the boy's face, searching for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda that experience taught him to expect. But he found only raw honesty mixed with terror that came from betting everything on a stranger's mercy. The watch wasn't valuable, couldn't buy a decent meal or pay an hour's wage. Its value lay entirely in what it represented to the small hand that offered it. That made it priceless in ways money couldn't measure, and dangerous in ways Jalen had learned to avoid. Emotional currency carried debts that gold couldn't settle. "I want to give it to you." Emmerich took one step closer, breaking his own safety barrier because standing still felt like giving up. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat counting down to acceptance or rejection. "So, you'll help my mama." The final words came out as confession and plea, stripping away any pretense that this was simple transaction. He was a child begging a monster to be merciful, and the shame of it burned through him even as necessity held him in place. The watch continued its steady ticking between them, measuring seconds that stretched into eternities. Jalen's face remained unreadable, carved from stone that had forgotten how to feel, but something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition of a moment that would define him as surely as it would define the boy. He'd made men disappear for lesser interruptions to his peace. He'd destroyed lives with casual indifference, treating human obstacles like paperwork, requiring signatures. But this small offering, this desperate gamble from someone who should have been at home playing with toys, instead of negotiating with devils, this demanded a different response. "What's your name?" The question came out quieter than Jalen intended, lacking the edge he usually wielded like a weapon. He hadn't asked someone's name in years. People were introduced to him, presented like gifts or problems requiring his attention. Direct inquiry suggested equality he rarely acknowledged. Emmerich Dareth. The boy's chin lifted slightly, claiming his identity even in the face of fear. His hand remained extended, the watch still offered, his entire body locked in position by will stronger than his years should possess. The blue plastic gleamed between them like a bridge spanning impossible distance, connecting two worlds that logic said should never touch. Behind them, the river whispered secrets to the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the city, a mother worked another shift, unaware her son was bartering his treasures with fate. Jalen reached out slowly, his movement deliberate as approaching wild creatures that startled easily. His fingers closed around the watch, feeling its lightness, its warmth from the boy's desperate grip. The plastic felt almost alive against his palm, carrying the weight of hope that defied its physical properties. Emmeric's hand dropped to his side once the watch transferred ownership, leaving him feeling naked without its familiar presence on his wrist. The pale line where the band had protected his skin from sun looked like a scar marking where something vital had been removed. His breathing came faster now, realizing there was no taking back what he'd done. "Tell me about your mama." Jalen's voice carried command disguised as invitation, the tone he used when extracting information from people who thought they were volunteering it freely. He turned the watch over in his hands, examining it with attention that seemed excessive for such an insignificant object. The boy's throat worked as he swallowed hard, gathering courage that had carried him this far, but felt depleted now that the moment had arrived. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, searching for something to hold on to that wasn't there anymore. "There's a man who comes every week." The words came out flat, drained of emotion by repetition and fear that had become familiar as furniture. Emmerich's eyes focused on the ground between them, unable to meet Jalen's gaze while confessing the shame of their situation. "He has papers. Legal papers, he says. About our apartment." His voice dropped lower, as if speaking quietly could somehow minimize the threat. The Cobrador's face flashed through his memory, ordinary features that held extraordinary menace, the kind of danger that wore suits and smiles while destroying lives. Jalen's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened imperceptibly around the watch. He knew the type, parasites who fed on desperation, who used law as a weapon sharper than any blade. They were harder to fight than street criminals because the system protected them, gave them legitimacy that made their theft legal. He tells her she owes money she doesn't have. Emmerich's words gained momentum now. The dam breaking under pressure of secrets kept too long. His small hands gestured helplessly, trying to shape the invisible weight that crushed their household. "Interest and fees and terms I don't understand, but I understand that he's going to take our home." The naked fear in his voice cut through the evening air like glass breaking, sharp and impossible to ignore. His eyes finally lifted to meet Jalen's, searching for something. Belief, mercy, intervention, anything that looked like salvation. The river behind them had darkened to match the sky, no longer golden, but deep blue turning to black. Streetlights flickered on along the path, casting orange halos that pushed back gathering shadows. The park transformed around them, becoming a different place where different rules applied, and children shouldn't be conducting business with men like Jalen. "Mama works 2 jobs, but it's never enough." The confession came easier now, words that had been locked inside, finding freedom in the presence of someone who might actually have power to change them. Emmerich's voice cracked with the weight of watching his mother break slowly under pressure that never relented. "She counts money at the kitchen table every night, moving coins around like puzzle pieces that won't fit no matter how she arranges them." His hands mimicked the motion, fingers shuffling invisible currency that always came up short. The image of his mother's tired face, her silent tears, her forced smiles, all of it poured into his words like water from a breaking dam. Jalen listened without interruption, his stillness absolute except for the thumb that traced the watch's face in slow circles. He'd heard countless confessions in his career, from men begging for mercy, from rivals trying to negotiate, from people who thought words could save them from consequences. But this was different. This carried the purity of truth unmixed with manipulation. The boy wasn't trying to play him. He was simply desperate enough to try anything, even approaching the devil himself if it meant protecting the angel who'd raised him. "Last night he came late. I heard them talking through my wall." Emmerich's voice dropped to almost a whisper, shame mixing with anger at his own helplessness. His small frame seemed to shrink further, as if the memory physically diminished him. He told her she has 2 weeks. 2 weeks, or we lose everything. The timeline hung between them like a countdown to detonation, each day ticking away toward disaster. His eyes remained fixed on Jalen's face now, searching for any reaction that might indicate whether this gamble had been foolish or inspired. The watch ticked in Jalen's palm, counting seconds that suddenly felt precious. He studied the boy with new attention, seeing past the surface to the steel underneath. 9 years old and already understanding that sometimes survival meant betting everything on long odds and dangerous men. And after he left, Jalen's question was soft but precise, drilling down to the core that mattered. His eyes never left Emmerich's face, reading the truth written in trembling lips and clenched jaw. She cried. 2 words that carried the weight of worlds ending, delivered with the flat affect of someone reporting weather rather than devastation. Emmerich's hands had stopped moving, hanging at his sides like dead things. She thinks I don't hear, but our apartment is small and walls are thin. She cries like she's trying not to make sound, like even tears are something we can't afford. His own eyes glistened now, moisture gathering despite his determination to remain strong. Admitting his mother's pain felt like betrayal, but hiding it felt like abandoning her to face monsters alone. Jalen stood slowly, his movement fluid despite the tension in his frame. He towered over the boy, their size difference emphasizing the absurdity of this entire exchange. A child had approached him with a plastic watch, asking him to fight a different kind of enemy than the ones he usually faced. The simplicity of it was almost beautiful, almost enough to make him forget why he'd stopped believing in simple solutions. You understand what you're asking? Mew. His voice carried no threat, just clarification, seeking to ensure the boy grasped the magnitude of involving someone like him in their lives. Emmerich nodded without hesitation, his certainty unshaken despite his fear. I'm asking you to make the bad man go away so my mama can stop crying. The words held childish directness that cut through complexity to reach essential truth. He didn't understand the mechanisms of power, didn't know how Jalen would accomplish what he was asking. He only knew that everyone said this man could do impossible things, and saving his mother felt like the most impossible thing in the world. Jalen's fingers closed completely around the watch, his decision made in the space between heartbeats where logic couldn't interfere with instinct. He'd built an empire on calculated moves and measured responses, yet this moment demanded something his carefully constructed world had no framework for. The boy's courage had cracked something he'd thought sealed permanently shut. Do you trust me? The question hung in the cooling air, weighted with implications neither of them could fully comprehend. Emmerich's response came without hesitation, a nod that spoke of faith born from desperation, rather than knowledge. Trust was a currency Jalen rarely accepted, because it created debts more binding than money ever could. But the boy's immediate affirmation, given despite every instinct that should have screamed warnings, carried a responsibility he couldn't refuse. The watch in his palm felt heavier now, transformed from plastic into promise. Then go home. His voice dropped lower, carrying the authority that moved mountains and silenced rooms. Emmerich's eyes widened slightly, searching for confirmation that this wasn't rejection disguised as dismissal. Jalen's expression softened imperceptibly, a crack in granite that few living people had ever witnessed. Go home to your mama. Don't tell her where you've been or what you've done. The command was gentle despite its firmness, protecting the boy from explanations that could complicate what needed to remain simple. And don't look back when you walk away. The final instruction carried weight beyond its surface, meaning a test of faith, a protection against witnessing things a child shouldn't see, a clean break between worlds that should never have touched. Emmerich stood frozen for 3 full seconds, his mind processing whether success looked like this or if he'd misunderstood everything. Then he turned, his worn sneakers carrying him across grass that had witnessed a transaction defying every rule of both their worlds. His shoulders stayed rigid with the effort of not turning around, not checking if the man still watched, not verifying that the sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. Jalen remained on the bench until the boy disappeared beyond the tree line, swallowed by shadows that claimed the park as their territory once darkness fell. Only then did he look down at the watch in his hand, its blue face reflecting the orange street light in fractured patterns. The second hand continued its steady rotation, indifferent to the lives it had just connected. He slipped it into his pocket where it rested against his phone, a device worth more than everything Emmerich's family owned, now sharing space with a child's most precious possession. The contrast wasn't lost on him, the absurdity of his situation crystallizing with painful clarity. He'd accepted payment from a 9-year-old, agreed to terms he hadn't negotiated, committed himself to protecting strangers because a boy had been brave enough to ask. Standing slowly, Jalen pulled out his phone and dialed a number only 12 people in the world possessed. The call connected before the first ring completed, answered by someone who understood that late evening calls meant movement was required. I need information on a debt collector working residential properties in Greenville. His voice carried its usual efficiency, emotion stripped away to leave only purpose. Name is unknown. Target is a woman named Marin Dareth and her son. I want everything. Who he works for, what organization backs him, how deep this goes. He paused, letting silence emphasize what came next. And I want it tonight. The person on the other end didn't ask questions, didn't express surprise that Jalen was personally involving himself in something so far beneath his usual scope. That was why they held their position, because they knew when to act, rather than inquire. The call ended with mutual understanding that morning would bring answers whether the world was ready to provide them or not. Jalen walked away from the bench, leaving behind the peace he'd come seeking, but carrying something that felt unexpectedly like purpose. The watch ticked steadily in his pocket, keeping time for obligations he'd never anticipated. Behind him, the river continued its ancient journey, carrying reflected lights and secrets toward an ocean that had seen everything and judged nothing. By the time he reached his car, his mind had already shifted into the mode that had built and maintained his empire through 2 decades of careful calculation. The cobrador was a symptom, not the disease. Removing him would be simple, but understanding the system that enabled him required deeper investigation. Jalen had learned long ago that solving problems meant killing roots, not just trimming branches. His driver opened the door without comment, long accustomed to his employer's unpredictable schedule and darker moods. But tonight something was different, a subtle shift in energy that experienced eyes couldn't quite categorize. Jalen settled into leather seats that cost more than 3 months of Marin's combined wages, the irony sharp as broken glass. "Home," he said simply, then reconsidered. "No, take me to the office." Work would fill the hours until information arrived, and idle time invited questions he wasn't ready to answer. The watch continued its steady ticking against his thigh, a reminder that promises made to children carried weight that contracts signed in blood couldn't match. The information arrived at 2 in the morning, delivered by encrypted message that dissolved after reading, leaving no trace except the knowledge it contained. Jalen sat in his office surrounded by windows overlooking a city that slept unaware of the decisions being made in its darkness. The cobrador's name was Perry Hutchins, and he was exactly what Jalen had suspected, a parasite operating in the gray space between legal and criminal. Hutchins worked for a company called Residential Equity Solutions, which was itself owned by a shell corporation registered in Delaware. The trail went deeper, connecting to a network of predatory lenders who targeted working families with contracts designed to fail. They were legal in the strictest technical sense, protected by fine print and lawmakers who'd received generous campaign contributions. Jalen's jaw tightened as he read through the operation structure, recognizing the sophistication that separated this from common street crime. These people destroyed lives with paperwork, left families homeless through foreclosure procedures that courts rubber-stamped without investigation. Marin's case was routine for them. Another struggling mother drowning in compounding interest and impossible terms. The file included Hutchins's schedule, his patterns, the 3 other families he was currently pressuring through similar methods. It contained bank records showing money flowing through layers of corporate protection, photographs of a man who looked disappointingly ordinary for someone causing such extraordinary harm. He lived in a modest house, drove a practical sedan, probably told himself he was just doing his job. Jalen made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, each brief and coded in language that sounded like business discussion to any potential surveillance. By the time morning light crept across his desk, mechanisms were in motion that would dismantle Residential Equity Solutions from foundation to roof. But that was long-term correction. Marin needed immediate relief. The 4th call went to someone who specialized in making problems disappear through channels that left no fingerprints. "There's a man visiting an address on Kirkwood Street." Jalen provided the building number, apartment, and Hutchins expected arrival time based on his weekly pattern. He's going to decide his job isn't worth what it pays him anymore. Permanent decision? The voice on the other end carried professional curiosity rather than moral judgment, treating the question like discussing weather patterns. Jalen considered the option, weighing the satisfaction of permanent removal against the complications it would create. Violence was a tool he used sparingly, saved for threats that couldn't be neutralized through smarter means. No, just convincing enough that he leaves the city and finds a different profession. That was actually harder than the alternative, requiring psychological precision rather than physical force. But it matched what the boy had asked for. Make the bad man go away, not make him dead. The distinction mattered in ways Jalen was only beginning to understand. The arrangements took less than an hour to finalize, and by the time Greenville's early risers began their commutes, Hutchins' fate was sealed without his knowledge. Jalen leaned back in his chair, exhaustion pressing against his eyes, but satisfaction settling in his chest. The watch sat on his desk now, its cheerful blue face somehow incongruous next to financial reports and strategic documents that directed millions of dollars. He picked it up carefully, examining it in the growing light that turned his office from shadows to stark reality. The scratches on its surface told stories of a boy's active life, playground collisions, dropped on concrete, worn during adventures that childhood should contain. Christmas morning seemed impossibly distant from this moment, yet the watch connected them across time and circumstance. Jalen wondered what Emmerich was doing right now, whether he'd slept at all, or spent the night worrying that his gamble had failed. The image of the boy's face, desperate but determined, terrified but brave, had burned itself into memory with unexpected permanence. He'd seen hardened criminals break under less pressure than what daily life imposed on that family. His phone buzzed with a message confirming that watchers were in place, that when Hutchins arrived for his weekly intimidation session, he'd find himself the one being intimidated, not through threats or violence, but through the sudden awareness that he'd attracted attention from forces that operated beyond his understanding. Sometimes fear born from mystery was more effective than fear born from confrontation. The sun climbed higher, transforming his office windows into mirrors that reflected a man who'd spent the night protecting strangers for payment worth maybe $15. The financial absurdity should have been laughable, yet Jalen felt something uncomfortably close to satisfaction. His empire had been built through taking territory, taking power, taking whatever he needed to survive and dominate. This was the first time in recent memory he'd given something that didn't serve his strategic interests. By noon, his regular operations demanded attention that couldn't be postponed further. Meetings, decisions, problems requiring his particular brand of solution. But the watch stayed in his pocket, ticking steadily through negotiations and discussions, a small reminder that power could be used for something besides accumulation. The day passed in its usual rhythm of controlled chaos and managed crises. Evening found him back at the office, reviewing reports that confirmed Hutchins had indeed visited Kirkwood Street that morning. The encounter had lasted less than 5 minutes before the debt collector departed with notable haste, his face reportedly pale and his hands shaking. He'd driven directly home, packed 2 suitcases, and left Greenville heading north without stopping for gas or food. 3 days passed with Jalen monitoring the situation through channels invisible to everyone except those executing his will. Hutchins had disappeared into North Carolina, seeking employment in retail management far from debt collection and the mysterious men who'd suggested his immediate relocation. The message had been clear enough: leave the families alone, leave the city entirely, and never return unless he preferred consequences left carefully unspecified. Residential Equity Solutions collapsed within 72 hours, brought down by simultaneous investigations from 3 state agencies that discovered irregularities they'd somehow overlooked for years. The shell corporation dissolved, its owners scattering like roaches when lights flicked on. 4 other families found themselves suddenly freed from crushing payment schedules that had been legally predatory, if not technically illegal. Marin's paperwork arrived on the 4th day, delivered not to her mailbox but placed carefully inside her apartment door while she worked her early morning shift at the diner downtown. The envelope contained documents stamped and notarized, declaring her debt satisfied in full through a complex transaction involving the original lender, several corporate entities, and a benefactor whose name appeared nowhere in the official records. The apartment was hers, fully paid, owned outright without mortgage or lien. Legal language filled 3 pages explaining what had happened in terms designed to obscure, rather than illuminate. But the essential truth was undeniable. She was free from the debt that had been slowly crushing her life into dust. A separate page contained contact information for a property lawyer should she have questions, with fees already paid for comprehensive legal review. Jalen had spent considerable effort ensuring the transaction appeared legitimate, routed through sufficient legal channels that no one could question its validity. He'd paid fair market value for her debt through intermediaries, then forgiven it through a charitable foundation that existed solely to provide cover for operations like this. The entire procedure had cost him less than he spent on dinner most evenings. But the watch had demanded one more element to complete the transaction properly. Jalen had taken it to a jeweler he occasionally used for items requiring discretion and skill. The man had cleaned it carefully, replaced the battery, buffed minor scratches from the crystal face without removing the character that made it uniquely Emmerich's possession. The work had been done with the same attention usually reserved for pieces worth thousands. On the back of the watch, using tools designed for engraving precious metals on cheap plastic, the jeweler had carefully inscribed words in script small enough to be discreet, but clear enough to read. The time she has now is only hers. No signature, no indication of who'd written them. just a statement that could mean anything or everything depending on perspective. Jalen delivered the watch himself under cover of darkness, placing it carefully inside the same envelope that contained Marin's freedom. The blue plastic looked almost luminous against the white paper, its face reflecting hallway light in cheerful defiance of the serious documents surrounding it. He left it positioned where she'd see it immediately, impossible to miss or misunderstand. Then he disappeared before dawn could reveal him, another shadow in a city full of them, leaving behind only the evidence of intervention that defied explanation. His car moved through empty streets, carrying him back toward the world he understood, where power was currency and mercy was weakness. Yet the weight in his pocket felt lighter now, the obligation transferred back to its rightful owner. Marin found the envelope when she returned home at 7, exhausted from serving breakfast to customers who tipped poorly and complained constantly. Her hands shook as she opened it, confusion giving way to disbelief as she read through legal documents that seemed designed to trick her into false hope. She read them 3 times before accepting they meant what they appeared to mean. The watch fell into her lap, its familiar blue plastic instantly recognizable even before her mind could process its presence. She picked it up with trembling fingers, seeing it cleaned and restored, but unmistakably her son's most precious possession. The engraving on the back caught morning light streaming through their small window, words that made her throat close and tears spill unchecked. She sat on their worn couch holding the watch and papers, trying to construct a narrative that explained any of this rationally. Debts didn't simply vanish. Apartments didn't magically become owned. Children's watches didn't disappear and return bearing cryptic messages. Yet all of it had happened, documented and real, sitting in her hands like evidence of miracles she'd stopped believing in years ago. Emmerich emerged from his bedroom, drawn by the sound of his mother's crying, alarmed until he saw her face and realized these weren't the silent tears of desperation. She looked up at him with eyes that held confusion and joy, and questions multiplying faster than answers could form. "Baby, where did you go the other day, when you said you were at the library?" The boy's expression flickered between guilt and relief, understanding somehow that his secret had produced results beyond his wildest hopes. He walked to his mother slowly, seeing the watch in her hand, and knowing without explanation that his offering had been accepted, his plea answered by forces he couldn't name. "I found someone who could help," he said simply, the truth reduced to its essential core. Marin pulled him into an embrace that tried to protect him retroactively from whatever danger he'd walked into for her sake. Her arms wrapped around his small frame, while her mind raced through implications that terrified her even as they saved her. What had her son done? Who had he approached? What price would eventually come due for intervention that seemed impossibly generous? But Emmerich simply held her back, feeling her heartbeat slow from panic to acceptance, knowing that sometimes miracles arrived without explanations and had to be accepted on faith. The watch ticked between them, keeping perfect time once again, marking seconds that belonged to them now without the shadow of loss hanging over each moment. Weeks transformed into months with the quiet persistence of seasons changing, and Marin's life rebuilt itself on foundations that felt impossibly solid after years of standing on sand. The apartment that had been a temporary shelter threatening to vanish became a true home, decorated gradually with small purchases that represented permanence rather than desperation. She worked 1 job now instead of 2, the financial breathing room allowing her to actually see her son during daylight hours. Exhaustion still visited her body, but it was the honest tiredness of reasonable work rather than the bone-deep collapse that comes from fighting impossible battles. Her face began showing traces of the woman she'd been before survival became her only occupation. Emmerich returned to being a child in ways he'd forgotten were possible, though something in his eyes retained the weight of what he'd done and what it had cost. The watch never left his wrist except when he bathed, its presence a constant reminder of the transaction that had altered their trajectory. He wore it to school, to the park, to bed at night where its soft ticking accompanied his dreams. Other children asked about it sometimes, commenting on its scratched face and faded band, not understanding that its value had nothing to do with appearance. Emmerich simply smiled and changed the subject, protecting his secret with the dedication of soldiers guarding vital intelligence. His mother asked questions in those early weeks, gentle inquiries designed to extract truth without forcing confession, but Emmerich held his silence with determination that surprised them both, understanding instinctively that some secrets protected better than explanations ever could. He told her only that he'd found someone who helped people, and that the watch had been payment for services rendered. Marin stopped pushing after the 5th or 6th attempt, recognizing that her son's stubbornness came from her own genetic contribution, and that his protection of this mystery served purposes she couldn't fully grasp. She researched instead, listening to neighborhood gossip with new attention, piecing together fragments about men who operated in shadows and debts that disappeared without logical explanation. The picture that emerged terrified and comforted her in equal measure. Greenville had its underground powers like any city, figures whose names were spoken carefully, and whose influence extended into places official authority couldn't reach. She suspected her son had somehow approached one of these people, trading his innocence and his treasure for her salvation. She began leaving the apartment more carefully, her eyes scanning streets for threats or surveillance she couldn't name but felt certain existed. Paranoia or awareness. She couldn't distinguish between them, but she taught Emmerich to notice his surroundings, to recognize when attention felt wrong. Yet months passed without collection being demanded, and slowly her tension eased into cautious acceptance. The boy developed a new routine on Saturday afternoons, telling his mother he was exploring the city on his bicycle while actually pedaling straight to the park by the river. He never approached the bench, never tried to make contact, simply positioned himself where he could see if the man who'd changed everything still kept his solitary appointments with the water. More often than not, the bench sat empty, but occasionally, perhaps once a month, Jalen would appear like a figure from Emmerich's memory rather than present reality. The boy would watch from his safe distance, verifying that his benefactor still existed, still breathed, still sat by the water seeking whatever peace such men could find. Jalen knew about these observations, had known from the first Saturday the boy appeared with his bicycle and careful distance. His security team reported the pattern, offered to intervene or investigate, but he waved them off with instructions to let the child be. The surveillance felt appropriate somehow, a balance to the watch he'd returned, a connection neither of them needed to acknowledge directly. On the rare occasions their visits coincided, Jalen would allow himself a brief glance in the boy's direction, never long enough to constitute interaction, just acknowledgement that he saw and understood. Emmerich would nod slightly from his position 50 yards away, then leave after 10 minutes, the ritual complete. They were bound by an agreement neither had fully articulated, but both honored absolutely. Spring arrived with Bradford pears blooming white along the river path, their sweet smell mixing with the green scent of new growth. Marin planted flowers in pots on their small balcony, transforming the space into something that belonged in lifestyle magazines rather than government assistance housing. She hummed while cooking dinner, a sound Emmerich hadn't heard in so long he'd forgotten his mother knew songs. Summer heat settled over Greenville like a weighted blanket, turning the river into liquid mercury that reflected sunlight in blinding sheets. Emmerich's Saturday visits continued with mechanical regularity, but the bench remained empty through June and most of July. The boy began to wonder if Jalen had left the city entirely, moved on to whatever business occupied men of his nature and reputation. Then on a Saturday in late August, with school approaching and childhood running out faster than Emmerich wanted to acknowledge, the bench held its familiar occupant once again. Jalen sat in his customary position, watching the water with the same stillness that had first drawn the boy's desperate attention 6 months earlier. Emmerich's heart accelerated the moment he spotted the figure, his bicycle suddenly feeling inadequate as transportation for this moment. He'd maintained his distance throughout all previous sightings, but today something felt different. Completion hung in the air like humidity, suggesting that observation time had ended and contact had become necessary again. He dismounted carefully, leaning the bike against an oak tree that had probably witnessed 100 similar moments of human courage overcoming fear. His hand smoothed his shirt automatically, a gesture absorbed from watching his mother prepare for job interviews and parent-teacher conferences. The watch caught afternoon light, its blue face gleaming like a beacon connecting past to present. The walk across open grass felt longer than his original approach had been, though logic insisted the distance was identical. But he was different now, 6 months taller, carrying knowledge that childhood couldn't quite contain anymore, understanding costs and debts in ways that separated him from classmates who still believed in simple fairness. Jalen turned his head before Emmerich reached speaking distance, acknowledging the approach with the barest tilt of his chin. His expression revealed nothing, but something in his posture suggested he'd been expecting this convergence eventually. Men who controlled cities through information and anticipation didn't get surprised by 9-year-old boys keeping vigil at public parks. Sir, the same word that had opened their first conversation, delivered with more confidence now but carrying equal respect. Emmerich stopped at the same careful distance he'd maintained before, understanding that proximity to power required consistent boundaries. His right hand rose automatically, displaying the wrist where the watch kept its perfect time. Jalen's eyes followed the gesture, taking in the cleaned watch that had been returned as part of their unspoken contract. A slight smile threatened the corner of his mouth before discipline suppressed it completely. "Still keeping good time," he observed, his voice carrying the same controlled quietness that made people lean closer to hear him. "Never stops, never slows down." Emmerich echoed his original description. The words transformed from desperate sales pitch into satisfied confirmation. The watch had survived their transaction, emerged restored, continued its purpose of marking moments that now belonged fully to his family, without shadows of loss hanging over each second. The river flowed between them and the opposite bank, carrying pieces of reflected sky toward an ocean neither of them would ever see but both understood existed. Somewhere downstream, the water would mix with other rivers, lose its identity in something larger, become part of systems too vast to comprehend from this small stretch of South Carolina riverbank. "Your mama's doing well?" The question came casually, but carried weight that simple words couldn't communicate. Jalen was asking about outcomes, verifying that his intervention had produced the intended results, checking that no complications had emerged from his involvement in their lives. Emmerich nodded enthusiastically, his composure cracking slightly to allow genuine joy through calculated respect. "She smiles now. Real smiles, not the pretend ones." His voice carried wonder at the transformation, as if his mother's happiness was magic he'd witnessed but couldn't quite explain. "She planted flowers on our balcony, yellow ones that smell like lemons when the sun hits them right." The detail felt important to share. Evidence that survival had progressed into actually living. That breathing room allowed for beauty instead of just necessity. His mother had become someone who noticed flowers again, and that seemed like the truest measure of their changed circumstances. Jalen absorbed this information with the same attention he gave to financial reports and territorial negotiations, understanding that outcomes mattered more than methods in measuring success. The boy's face held no shadows of regret or fear, just satisfaction that his gamble had paid dividends beyond what cheap plastic should have purchased. That made the entire complicated intervention worthwhile in ways profit margins couldn't calculate. "And you? You doing well?" The question reversed their dynamic, treating Emmerich as an equal party to their arrangement, rather than a supplicant who'd been granted mercy. The boy straightened slightly at being asked, at having his well-being considered worth inquiry from someone whose time was valued in amounts that could feed families for months. "I'm good. Better than good." Emmerich's honesty was absolute, untainted by the social lying that adults use to smooth interactions and avoid uncomfortable truths. He was a child whose mother no longer cried, whose home couldn't be stolen, whose worst fears had been defeated by a stranger who'd chosen to care. That put him in a category of fortunate that statistics suggested he'd never reach. Jalen stood slowly, his movement drawing Emmerich's attention upward to emphasize the height difference that had always existed, but felt less intimidating now. Power measured in feet and inches mattered less than power measured in kept promises and answered prayers. The man who could destroy lives had chosen to save one instead, and that choice had rewritten their relationship's fundamental nature. "Keep that watch wound." The instruction carried multiple meanings, obvious and hidden, simple advice layered with deeper implications about maintaining what had been given, protecting what had been restored. Emmerich nodded his understanding, his hand moving to cover the watch face protectively, as if Jalen might reclaim it despite having returned it months ago. They stood in silence for a moment that stretched comfortably rather than awkwardly, two people connected by a transaction that defied normal rules of commerce and obligation. The park continued its Saturday afternoon rhythm around them, joggers passing, dogs chasing frisbees, couples walking hand in hand through spaces where danger and salvation had intersected and somehow produced grace instead of tragedy. Then Marin's voice cut through the distance, calling her son's name with the particular tone mothers use when children have wandered beyond approved boundaries. She stood at the park's entrance, one hand shading her eyes against the sun, her posture radiating concern that hadn't quite reached panic, but was approaching quickly. Emmerich turned toward her voice automatically, instinct overriding the moment's significance. But before he could move, Jalen spoke again, his voice low enough that only the boy could hear. "She's a good mother. You're a good son." "That's rarer than you think." The words carried approval that felt more valuable than any material reward could have been. The boy met his eyes one final time, communication passing between them that needed no translation. Gratitude, acknowledgement, mutual respect despite the absurd age difference. Then Emmerich ran toward his mother, his worn sneakers kicking up grass and dust, his bicycle forgotten in his rush to prevent her worry from escalating into fear. Maren caught him in an embrace that combined relief and mild irritation, her hands checking him over for injuries while her voice demanded to know why he'd wandered so far from where he'd said he'd be. Her eyes moved past her son to the man standing by the river, curiosity and recognition flickering across her face as she tried to place him in her mental catalog of neighborhood figures. Jalen inclined his head slightly in her direction, a gesture of acknowledgement that carried no threat but offered no explanation. He could see her intelligence working behind tired eyes, connecting invisible dots between her son's mysterious benefactor and this stranger who watched them with unreadable intensity. Understanding bloomed across her features, tentative but growing stronger. She mouthed 2 words across the distance, "Thank you," her lips forming them with emphasis that sound couldn't have strengthened. Jalen's response was barely perceptible, a nod so slight it might have been imagined, before he turned back toward the river and the solitude he'd been seeking before a brave child had interrupted his isolation 6 months earlier. Emmerich tugged his mother's hand, pulling her attention back to him, and away from uncomfortable questions about men who sat alone by rivers and somehow controlled fates through mechanisms she couldn't comprehend. "Come on, Mama. I want to show you something at home." His voice carried urgency designed to redirect her focus, protecting them both from knowledge that might feel heavier than ignorance. They walked away together, mother and son reunited and safe, their shadows stretching long across grass that would forget them the moment they left. But Emmerich glanced back once, just once, his hand rising to display the watch one final time. Jalen saw the gesture without turning, felt it like a weight settling permanently in the place where he stored the few things that mattered beyond power and territory. The river continued flowing, indifferent and eternal, carrying its secrets toward an ocean that accepted everything without judgment. And on a bench beside the water, a man who'd built an empire through taking sat alone with the memory of the one time he'd given something that money couldn't measure, to a boy who'd understood that true wealth was having a mother who could smile over flowers that smelled like lemons in the sun. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories like this. Until next time, remember that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help, and the most powerful thing we can do is choose to give it.